Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. Over the last 2 weeks, Russia has repeatedly violated NATO airspace. 17 Russian military drones entered Polish airspace on September 10th, followed by another drone in Romania. 3 Russian jets flew into Estonian airspace for 12 full minutes on September 19th, and drones of unknown origin shut down airports in Copenhagen and Oslo on September 22nd, not to mention the drones in Sweden today. In response to Russia's initial incursion, NATO launched Operation Eastern Sentry to increase and coordinate NATO efforts to counter Russia's drone threat. That is easier said than done. A new CNAS report released on September 10th, titled Countering the Swarm, details the tactics, techniques, and procedures necessary to counter drones and finds current American drone capabilities lacking. While NATO's response to the initial drone incursion over Poland centered around air-to-air missiles launched from manned fighter aircraft, this approach is not sustainable in the long term, given the very high cost of using air-to-air missiles to shoot down relatively cheap drones. NATO's counter-drone capabilities are not sufficient at present, and urgent action is needed to prepare NATO militaries to counter Russian drone-based threats. Here to discuss the way forward with us is CNAS's own Dr. Stacey Pettyjohn, who's the co-author with Molly Campbell on the new CNAS report, and a Brussels Sprouts regular, Mike Kaufman. Stacey and Mike, welcome to you both.
Great to be here.
Yep, thanks for having me back.
Quick bios. Stacey is a senior fellow and director of the defense program at CNAS, and Mike is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and a regular here on Brussels Sprouts. Okay, so Stacey, I actually wanted to start with your excellent report, which I highly recommend everyone looks at. And you start the report kind of with an anecdote describing the use of drones in the Middle East. You talk about the Iranian-backed militias who launched missiles in Iraq, launched a drone in Iraq. You talk about the drones in Syria, and then, of course, with the Yemeni Houthi rebels launching the drone attacks on Israel that forced the USS Carney into that 10-hour battle. And I actually want to read a small excerpt from the introduction because I think it's highly relevant to what we're seeing in the transatlantic theater. So Stacey and Molly write, in each instance, the individual attacks were unremarkable. Only 1 or 2 drones or missiles, and most were defeated by skilled American operators employing sophisticated air defenses. However, the frequency and scale of the drone strikes that began in October 2023 was not something U.S. troops had previously experienced. Although U.S. forces performed incredibly well under fire, the cumulative impact of these sustained attacks has been significant, injuring U.S. personnel, depleting U.S. air defense interceptor stockpiles, and degrading readiness. And so I read that because obviously that's a remarkable statement in its own right. But now for the transatlantic community dealing with this sustained, what looks like a sustained and escalatory use of Russian drones against NATO member states, it's really concerning. And so maybe just to start with you, having done this work before all of this happened, how have you responded to what you've seen in the European theater over the last 2 weeks or so?
Sure. Thanks for the kind words, Andrea. It's interesting. I think that we're seeing 2 different sort of instances of a drone threat in Europe right now. And it's important to differentiate them because you're going to find that there are different solutions, though none of them is perfect. So the Polish attack or the incursion of the 1921 drones was involved Russian long-range one-way attack drones that were clearly fired from Russia and more easily identifiable. And that is one problem and a real one that it sounds like Eastern Sentry is focused on. You could imagine that Russia begins a more sustained campaign of intimidation and harassment using drones like this and forcing NATO countries to shoot them down. They probably wouldn't cause a lot of damage, especially the drones that were fired into Poland are the ones with the smaller warheads. They're not going to likely cause a huge amount of destruction or death, but they are credible threats and they can still pose a threat to civilians and to undefended military equipment that's sitting in the open, especially things like aircraft that are pretty vulnerable. So they do have to be honored and they have to be intercepted. And that is one piece of the puzzle. Then what you've seen in Denmark and Sweden and other places, it's not clear who the actor is. The suspicion is it's Russia, and that seems like the obvious answer. But it's likely different drones. My guess would be that it is commercially available, larger fixed-wing drones of some type, because it sounds like they weren't small quadcopters, as have been seen over bases in the UK, like at Mildenhall, or in some of the bases in the United States. And that is more of an internal security threat in some ways. It's not necessarily coming from outside of their country. It's unclear where they're coming from, but it is probably launched by as a form of clandestine attack, either by intelligence or special operators, or maybe it's just civilians who are screwing around, which is always a possibility. A lot of people use drones for various purposes, and sometimes are just flying them to look into areas that they know are defended or they're not supposed to. And one of the challenges is finding those people in time and being able to do something about it, because it is normally going to fall under regulations, the domestic regulations about law enforcement, and be less of a military problem.
Yeah. Okay. That's really great. I know Jim is chomping at the bit to talk about what do we do, but let's stick on the problem for another minute, Mike, and just to hear your reactions. I mean, how are you viewing these last 2 weeks? And maybe talk a little bit about what the objective of the Kremlin is. What's going on from Russia's perspective?
I think that we can view this series of events as being connected or as distinct, right? And to me, the more significant one was the airspace violation strike into Poland, because that one was the most egregious and problematic. It was also of a larger scale and qualitatively different than anything we had seen before. The Polish and the German positions was that it was deliberate. Root sort of seems to hedge and says that whether deliberate or not seems to be covering different interpretations within the alliance among alliance members. But the way it looks is, if you don't believe that for some reason that this was a major Russian screw up, then very likely they were, employing decoy Gerbera drones to see what the reaction would be, how far into Poland they would get, and also, you could see it as potentially a test of the cohesiveness of the transatlantic alliance. Essentially, seeing what the U.S. response is to all these incidents. Does the United States care? Does it care about European security? Does it see this as its problem, or does it see this as primarily a European problem? The second interpretation is that a lot of this has to do with Ukraine. And throughout the course of the war of the last 3.5 years, the Russian military has conducted operations to threaten European nations, had conducted all sorts of sabotage operations, assassinations, arson, interdiction, what have you, and airspace violations as well. If we look at airspace violation incidents, there have actually been quite a few just this year. The media tends to focus on the most egregious thing that happened in the last week, but actually it's part of a very large series for those who follow these events. And it may be a bit qualitatively different than some of the other ones, but in Estonia alone, Russian aircraft have skirted certain parts of Estonian airspace that they traditionally skirt around some islands, and have violated several times already in 2025. So this might have been, we can get into it. This might be a particularly bad episode because they spent essentially 12 minutes flying through almost the length of Estonian airspace on the edge of it, cutting in and out with MiG-31s, which is clearly very intentional. But still, just to kind of put this into the context that actually Russian aircraft violate the airspace of NATO members with much greater frequency. So the second interpretation could be that it has to do with Ukraine and attempting to pressure European members over certain things having to do with their support for Ukraine or actions Ukraine has taken. I would be a liar if I told you that I fully understood the rationale inside Moscow for why they're doing what they're doing, and I'm skeptical of anyone who thinks that they know 100% what the reasoning is. But what it also reveals is something that we've talked about for some time, I think, and that I've worked on, Stacy's worked on extensively, which is that for all the discussion on countering drones, the challenge of high volume saturation attack from one way attack drones, particularly cheap ones, um, the low level of optimization within NATO air forces or NATO air defense to deal with this threat was fully on display in Poland a couple of weeks ago. The episode in Estonia, to me, I hate to put it this way, but it's much more traditional airspace violation, and NATO air power knows what to do with Russian aircraft violating NATO airspace. That's to me a much easier problem to solve. What happened in Poland, however, both from a military technical point of view and from a sort of alliance response point of view, raised a lot of questions. What would we do if that was a much larger scale attack? What would the responses be? And how would we deal with it?
I was just gonna dovetail on what Mike said because I think he's absolutely correct. You know, the aircraft was serious and hung around for a while in Estonian airspace, but that is something you know, and that is something where I think there's going to be more hesitation to respond kinetically because it poses a threat, but it's probably just sort of conducting some surveillance or presence type mission. With the one-way attack drones, they may be armed, they may not be armed, but they're more like a incoming cruise missile that you have to respond to and have to respond to quickly. And it doesn't have the same risk of escalation because it's quite clear that most countries don't care as much about uncrewed aircraft being shot down. And, you know, it's happened in India and Pakistan. It's happened for the US over Yemen and over Iran. And Eric Lynn Greenberg, who's another CNAS adjunct and MIT professor, has done some good work on this. But it does mean that they may actually, because they can be armed and frequently are armed, that they are an immediate threat that requires a really quick and decisive response.
Excellent points. So the one thing I guess I'll push back on slightly, and Jim and I have been kind of going nuts over the last couple of days, firing off multiple texts, kind of trying to figure out, document, stay on top of everything that's happened. And so while I very much appreciate the differences between the Estonian, the MiGs in Estonian airspace and some of these drone things, or the Polish drones, how are you all connecting the dots between all of these different episodes? I mean, because what it does look like is an extreme uptick in the scope and intensity of Russian antagonism against Europe. So when it is Poland and then Rome, and again, I appreciate that airspace incursions happen, that it's part of a pattern. But as Mike, you said, this is substantively different. When you connect all of these dots, and yes, NATO knows how to kind of deal with the airspace violations, but on the drones, I mean, Stacey, as you're talking about in this report, that's a much more unfamiliar place for the alliance to find itself. And you've got the drones in Poland, and then you've got them in Helsinki, or in Stockholm and Copenhagen and Oslo, and in over naval bases in Sweden. I mean, the uptick in all of this feels quite dramatic. And so I'm wondering if you all see it that way. Like, do you think that this is an intentional effort by Moscow to really ratchet up to try to set a new baseline normal that NATO is going to have to respond to? And what are the risks that come to that? I mean, Stacey, I know you and I were talking before. I mean, one thing it does is it has the potential to deplete European countries' resources. I mean, it is costly to scramble jets. It's really expensive to use the air-to-air missiles to shoot down drones. I mean, is that part of the strategy here? I guess what I'm pushing you on is, I think we can talk about each of the episodes, but when you zoom out and look at it as a whole, to me, it seems like we're in a different place than we were 2 weeks ago, where risks are higher now than they were before.
I mean, drone warfare is fundamentally cost warfare, right? It is the cost is so much a driver of the availability of these weapons, the willingness to use them, and the solutions that are effective over the long term. And you have to find cost effective solutions. And the Alliance, I think, is in a poor position right now with respect to that. So using these drones does seem to be like a strategy of hybrid warfare, gray zone tactics, whatever you want to call it, cost imposition against NATO. And it would seem like it is an attempt to see if they can push on the seams between countries, and especially the United States and the frontline states in Northeast Europe and Southern Europe to a lesser extent right now. As the US is sort of on the precipice of releasing its new national defense strategy, which is likely to significantly de emphasize Europe and may involve a global posture review and revisions, which involve the US removing many forces from Europe. So, kind of pushing at those and trying to poke those wounds and see what they can do in terms of weakening NATO cohesion as a whole. I don't know, Mike, you might disagree, but it seems pretty deliberate and it seems sensible to me to do that right now.
Yeah, I think so. To me, to be frank, I don't know, right? I'm still trying to put the pieces together myself. And I suspect that a lot of these incidents are going to be tied back to Russia. I agree with Stacy. That's the sort of natural uh, first, first likely threat actor you'd pick for this. Second, it's clearly meant to intimidate Europeans and also to see at a time when there are still visible rifts between the United States and Europe, despite all the positivity that kind of came out of the NATO summit, and despite some recently positive tweets or statements by Trump. I think we all can see that the policy itself isn't changing. Folks take very overly optimistic interpretations whenever Trump has like a good tweet day. And what they forget is the policy itself doesn't change all that much behind it. And it's sort of like an iceberg that's drifting in a certain direction. And Europeans are mostly focused on just maintaining the status quo. That's kind of their hope. Their hope is to maintain status quo. I think that's the one thing that won't be maintained if we have like 3 more years of this. That's my suspicion. The I think probably Russians are trying to push to see, right? This is just speculating, to see how how much does the United States still vest in European security? What is the collective response within the alliance? And what is NATO really going to do in response to any of this? And there is a challenge, as Stacy put forward, right? You can do things with uncrewed systems that you wouldn't do with manned aviation, right? The political costs and stakes are much lower. Attribution's much harder, right? We're now discussing like where did all these drones in Denmark come from? Did they come from a Shadow Fleet ship? Did it come from Russian operators on some other ship? They had to come from somewhere. They're not very long range, right? This is a physics problem. Like they had to have come from something off of Denmark. Were they launched within Denmark? There are so many of them. Surely the Danish authorities must be able to find who did it if they were launched from within the country, etc., etc. But you see, we have an attribution issue. We have intent attribution issue as well, as I suggested with the Polish strike. Well, the Poles and Germans were very clear on their position early on. You can see other folks hedging, right, regarding to what extent it was deliberate or not. And I'm simply responding to that, to the hedging within the official position of Root and others. And then we have okay, so what should NATO do? Is Eastern Sentry enough, right? Do we declare an operation, put some assets forward, rebrand the fact that actually none of the capabilities really optimized for this threat, and that many of those adaptations should have probably been made years back? Um, what else do we do? Review the policy on intercepts, right? Make it edgier, right? You see Rog Sikorsky and others going out there basically saying, okay, we might do what the Turks did essentially. You might shoot down a Russian aircraft, and if that happens, don't come back and complain to us.
And the Swedes have said it too.
Right.
So is Trump.
Yeah, he said, "Go ahead and do it, and we'll support you." And
I
Jim,
don't
I'm
think he
sure.
said we'll support you. I think he just said go ahead and do it.
Yeah, well, okay, maybe that's right. But listen, yeah, Andrew, you can take that to the bank or not and find out what
I
that's worth.
wouldn't take that to the bank. That's my point.
My comments are: you're welcome to take that tweet to the bank and find out what it's worth. But
Pawn
so
stars.
yeah, so you see this at least rhetorical revision of posture, but it does look like we're on a path to Russians playing around and finding out how, like, NATO, at some point, I think NATO may end up actually shooting down the Russian aircraft if they keep playing it this way.
And I'm not sure that they would mind. We can get into that. Like, I mean, let's talk about it. But Jim, you go ahead.
Well, let's get into it. So just to say that it's been reported that the ambassadors from Germany, France, and the UK in Moscow went to the Kremlin and warned the Russians that they would shoot down any aircraft getting into NATO airspace. I mean, I'm sure the language I'm using isn't exactly theirs, but that was what they were saying. So that happened yesterday. We had what you mentioned, Radek Sikorsky, and that speech that he gave, which has just been bouncing around the internet with all kinds of raised fists, in the comment section, in terms of flipping off the Russians and saying, "Bring it on." You've got Rudda has also been outspoken about airspace violations as well. Not quite with the rhetoric of Radek, but pretty more powerful than he normally is as a SecGen. And so there seems to be the tension level in a lot of Northern European capitals is pretty high. I was in meetings with Swedes, Andre and I, yesterday, and I had a couple meetings with them and with Finns, and they're all over this. They are. I mean, I've worked with those countries for decades, literally decades. They're saying stuff that you would never expect from Sweden and Finland. They've got a knife in their teeth right now on this, and so. But if you look at what the Poles have said to the Russians, with their finger in the chest, saying, "Come across our border with a plane and we're shooting it down." And you can bet all their Patriot units right now, or such as they are on high alert. And well, they are. I saw that being reported as well. So what does Moscow do? Do they sit there and just say, "Oh, Poles, you're full of shit as usual," or do you think they're going to actually they're going to say that, but then they're going to get some poor bastard in his cockpit and say, "Okay, we want you to fly into Polish airspace to test these guys," and they get shot down. I remember the Turkish shoot down, and that's a whole nother people who make a comparison with the Turkish shoot down. That's apples and oranges in a lot of different ways. So you have the Poles shooting down the Russian airplane. So what happens then? What if you were Moscow? What would you do? Number one, would you do that test? And number two, if your poor guy got shot down, you give him the Hero of the Revolution medal and all that. Take care of the family. Maybe he's captured, But what would you do if you're Moscow? What's in the playbook, Mike?
Oh, I see. I'm getting called on class. So look, first, I'm actually kind of skeptical the Russians are going to violate Polish airspace with a traditional fixed-wing aircraft. I think that they're employing light decoy drones very intentionally. And the Polish policy had been to shoot down anything that enters Polish airspace. The problem is you can see how hard that is, right? And actually, what it revealed is most of these Gerberas flew as far as they could until they ran out of fuel and crashed. Okay. And we got to see something that I think was obvious to those of us on the defense side, which is the F-35 was never made by its developers to go up against a styrofoam drone the Russians made in the garage. Okay.
Yeah, right.
And shooting that down with AIM-120 missiles that cost over $1 million is very far from a sustainable approach to air defense. Okay. It's actually possibly the least sustainable approach to air defense for European Air Force. And beyond that, Patriot batteries aren't going to help you all that much. If you plan to fire those at either Shahed derivatives or decoy drones, you're going to be out of very expensive munitions incredibly fast. They're optimized for high-end air defense and missile defense. And a lot of it has to do also about situational awareness, having the right sort of sight picture on the drones penetrating your airspace, the kind of things that Ukrainians really invested in that makes their air defense work, but it took years of iterative adaptation to counter the threat. But to your specific point, okay, what happens? So I actually think, if anything, Russians might try again and conduct yet another strike of some kind with drones in a NATO member's airspace. They might not go back to Poland. They might try it against somebody else. I was just in Finland this past week, both on exercise with Finnish forces and at the Helsinki Security Forum. And Finns are very much getting after it. But I can tell that this is a concern now for a lot of the countries that are potential targets for a Russian airspace violation of this type. And it's not an easy problem to manage, even if you have the ground-based air defenses that Finnish defense forces have. It's still not an easy challenge. What would Moscow do? This is an interesting question, because this is a question about intentionality. What are they actually after? Are they after an incident, right? They often historically think in reference to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Are they after an incident? Do they want a showdown, right, with NATO, create a crisis, and then see if either the United States will come to defuse it, or if the United States takes a sort of referee role, like it's taken in some cases, and basically said, "Oh, I'm not on either side of this. You know, this is
Good
not a
people
smart."
on both sides.
Yeah, let's exactly. And that would effectively separate the United States from European allies if the United States moves more into the referee role rather than the quarterback role, right? Sorry, to make football analogy, which Europeans have.
American football.
Yeah, American football, the one where the ball is not kicked very much. Yeah, so because the United States.
Mike, but it's also, so it's testing the US response, but it's also NATO's response. Like, it's also like, will it just be a coalition of the willing?
Sure.
Where like half the other NATO member states say we don't have a dog in this fight. And so now we've reduced NATO as a unit to just a smaller coalition of the willing.
It becomes the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Forces, the Brits out there, saying, follow me.
Yeah, but okay, can I just say something? But when Russians say NATO, they mean the United States. Okay, like the old joke in our profession that when Russians say NATO, they mean the United States, and when Europeans say NATO, they also mean the United States. When Americans say NATO, they mean Europeans.
I'm not a Russia expert, so but just from a like strategic viewpoint, I would not send a crewed aircraft in. I mean, Russia's lost a good number of aircraft. Why risk it right now when you can sort of pose a similar test, and probably more frequent, varied, and larger one in some ways for NATO, where shooting down one fighter, yes, there's risk involved, but that is actually what NATO is prepared for. Sending in lots of these small drones, and then, it gives Russia an opportunity to deny it, to let Belarus deny it, other countries, they can overfly the airspace. And also, if they end up being unarmed, puts the onus of escalation on NATO and just sort of feeds into their narrative. So it seems to me it would be smarter to actually employ the drones in a lot of different places, as it seems to be happening, and keep pushing. And you can have the similar test on the US's response. Are they going to actually pony up any sort of capabilities to contribute to this Eastern Sentry operation or not? And stress the allies who are going to probably in the near term have to rely on fighter aircraft, which are not optimized for this, though they could make simple investments in laser guided rockets instead of using AIM-120 or AIM-9s. And that is much more cost effective and has worked really well for the US in the Middle East. The US is just already running short on them, and took some of these rockets that were designated for Ukraine and sent them to CENTCOM instead. So I don't know what NATO stockpiles look like in that area.
But I agree with Stacey exactly with what you're saying. But with between Poland and Russia, it goes back to what Mike said in terms of intent. what would the Russians do? I think on a rational basis, a smart basis, just using drones. I think that what you said is right. But Poland and Russia, it depends on what the Russians want. Do they want a provocation? Are they? These are two people who hate each other. They are in the playground. They're shoving each other. Right now, they're shoving each other. And so you've got to the Poles now saying, hit me, hit me. Go ahead, hit me. And it depends on what the Russians want. And rationality and cost effectiveness go out the window. The Russians go, you, bang, and they do that not with a drone. They send sorry for the language to all of our
Ooh, it's getting
Brussels sprouts,
spicy on Brussels
Okay,
sprouts.
swear on this podcast.
but they send aircraft over. And you know what? And I'll just throw this out. They send a bomber escorted by 3 aircraft over the Polish border and say, do something. That's the kind of thing that we've done in the past, different circumstances, but it's like a fun op. We will send okay, you don't want us to go through these waters. We're sending a freaking carrier battle group through right now. So screw you. Cleaned up language, Andrea, cleaned up language. So for me, as I look at this, when it's Poland and it's Russia, and it is Radek saying what he said, and you've got what's his name, Medvedev, shaking the nuclear saber a couple days ago about bomb shelters. I don't know if you saw that. I think you're in a whole different place. And maybe there is some strategy behind this for the Russians. They really are looking for a provocation because they know what they're going to do. That they lose a plane, then they're going to do X, Y, and Z. Because they're going to know that NATO isn't going to do something or blah, blah, whatever it might be. They might be doing this provocation for a specific reason, and they're hoping they get shot down. They'll be upset if they don't get shot down. That's where I'm looking on this thing because of those two countries, the hatreds between the two of them, and where the rhetoric has been over the past couple days. What do you think? I know I scared you all. I know I used
No, Jim. Jim,
my
it's certainly a
Pentagon
theory.
voice. I used my Pentagon voice. I shouldn't have done that. But anyway, go ahead.
It's certainly a theory. I'm debating with myself the question of do Russians want an incident? Do they actually want an incident standoff?
Yeah.
Do they want to escalate the situation
Yeah.
as a way by which to separate the United States from Europe? Is that what they're after?
Yeah.
Are they just testing U.S. security commitment to Europe and to what extent U.S. is interested in European security? Testing is a very weak analysis because, let's be honest, if you don't know adversary intent, then you're just going to say, oh, they're just probing and testing. That's like an analyst way of saying, I don't know. I don't know what's going on.
Exactly.
That's a fair answer.
Yes,
I'm just
exactly.
much more honest than saying I don't know. I don't need like this other veneer of this is a complex probing testing campaign. We can just say we don't know. We're not sure. That's all right too. But the big question is, do they actually, this seems to be a coherent campaign. Are they after something specific, and do they want an incident with NATO? Yes or no? That's a determination like I think everyone has to make. And if
to me, that it is definitely a theory and it's not zero probability. And to me, the probability of that feels higher now. I mean, obviously, because now we've seen all of this escalation up to it. But to me, it seems plausible, like not something that's easily ruled out.
Sure. And, but they could well lose from it. However, I agree with Jim. I do not like the Turkey example. The Turkey example is actually pretty bad. Turkey did not win in that exchange, to be perfectly honest. And the reason for that, they didn't stop Russian airspace violations of Turkish airspace. They, to some extent, got knuckled under by Moscow a year after the incident. And the truth of it is that the reason it didn't work as well for Turkey, even though it looked very robust and muscular when they shot down that Russian Su-24, is they had not coordinated any of that with NATO allies. They had done it first, and then they ran to NATO and to the United States for support. And they were largely on their own, as best I could tell, facing Moscow afterwards. And I think that European allies in this case have made sure to avoid doing things in that way and trying to do things more coherently and not sort of shooting from the hip first and then expecting that the United States is going to back them up. And I think that's the right way to do it. I don't see the Turkish case as a good example for how other NATO members should act, however you judge the outcome of that episode.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how many people are raising that now. I mean, I agree with you. Not many people remember what happened. I do, but I was up having to deal with it. But I think it's interesting how history is being misused by a lot of people who are saying, "Look, the Turks did this. There's
Mm-hmm.
no reason that we can." I mean, the world didn't end. There wasn't a nuclear
Sure.
exchange. And just one more thing too, and because I know Andrea's got to come in. Um, we are entering in and are in a period where a mistake or a misinterpretation, a misconception can lead to a slippery slope where you're going to have an exchange, where the escalation takes off because there's been a misjudgment made. So just to put that on the table, this is a
There's the
dangerous
mistakes,
period
and
just
then
for
when
that.
you have Russian and NATO forces operating in ever closer proximity, then there's accidents. I mean, there's that that whole reservoir. But
Yeah,
so that, I mean, theory number one is, that Russia wants a provocation, that it wants an incident, as we said. But theory number two is also what Stacy said, which is also highly plausible. And
right.
so, Stacy, talk a little bit about like what you think the impact on NATO then would be. I mean, we've talked about the cost asymmetry, and that's a major kind of cost imposition strategy on NATO. In your paper, you also, I mean, you talk about readiness. Like a lot of these are smaller European forces. In some cases, like you said, it's kind of like an internal security issue, but that drains resources. And if we're always focused on chasing the next thing and expending resources and being on high alert and high
Right.
readiness to address these incursions, talk a little bit more about what you think the impact over a sustained period could be on these European forces inside NATO.
I mean, this could become a huge distraction and resource suck, and where you're
Right.
focused just on something that's essentially a boiling the frog strategy rather than a very serious threat
Short, sharp.
and the precursor to some sort of larger attack and invasion. I do think there are a lot of things that NATO can and should do, especially some of the northeastern countries that border with Russia. And they have long supposedly been working on integrated air and missile defense. Though, from what I'd seen when I led a war game like 5 or 6 years ago now, maybe longer than that, with the Baltic states and the Poles. They're a long way from where they need to be, even in terms of just having the sensors in place to provide early warning for the high-end threats, let alone these low-end threats. And I've read that Lithuania is putting in place an acoustic sensor network akin to what Ukraine has. And that seems to be sensible for some of the cheaper drones and provides a way of, detecting them and putting in place defenses. But I think that the alliance does need to work on this information sharing, putting in place the sensors, because these are the air threats like this, the attacks they do cross boundaries. And this is where sharing of information, where the Finns, the Swedes, the Baltics, the Poles, they all should be linked up together and ideally have something that is more a real time common operating air picture, which they don't have. In the near term, I think they are going to have to deal with a band aid approach and figure out what the AWACS fleet that NATO has and the other airborne early warning and control aircraft can sustain, because they're going to be critical in terms of seeing these drones and then having some fighters on alert, ready to be launched if necessarily, ideally with lower cost rockets than anything else. Because it would, no one wants there to be loss of life or damage to critical infrastructure or military equipment either unnecessarily. Long term, I do think they need to move towards, you know, some point defenses and gun trucks like Ukraine has. Guns are really the solution to the cheap drones. They're the obvious one and the one that the US military doesn't want to invest in. Hopefully, NATO doesn't fall by the same biases and prejudices that the US has for wanting the exquisite systems. They're mobile, so you can move them around as necessary. You're still never going to be able to defend everywhere. but they will help with sort of the border side of things. The smaller drones is something that NATO should take some time to study, and they're going to have to work through the legal sort of uh, the laws and the policies in place in each of the member states, which is different. So it's going to be really complicated and difficult to figure out what the military can actually do um, uh, to develop a response to these drones that might be being launched by boats or maybe internally. Though I see that a little bit more right now as a nuisance, though there's always the risk of something like a spider's web attack being launched on NATO instead of Ukraine doing that against Russia.
Can you both talk just, and Jim, I know you want to jump in, but I'm hoping this is still related to what Stacey said about kind of like, are there lessons learned from Ukraine? So obviously the gun trucks is a great one. Are there other things that you're seeing that Ukraine is doing effectively to on drone anti-drone warfare that you think NATO countries need to think about? And I guess the second question too is given the kind of rate of innovation in drone warfare that's been taking place in Ukraine, is Russia way ahead of where the US and NATO is in terms of the drones and the drone technology? Like how does NATO stack up to where Russia is, given that they've been fighting with these over the last many years now?
Maybe we'll jump on. So, first, are they ahead? In a lot of ways, yes, but keep in mind that this is meant to be an offset or something meant to be complementary in their force, whereas we retain traditional advantages, right, of advanced airspace power, long-range precision strike, having much larger magazine depth, and more capable ammunition. Many of these capabilities are sort of a poor man's cruise missile in some respects, and yes, in those areas they are ahead, but if we wanted to, we could catch up. It's just the United States and other countries are married to more exquisite systems. That's where the money is for defense contractors and primes, and there has to be a strong demand signal to build out this set of capabilities. Regarding counters, the problem to me is straightforward, but it's a bit harder to solve. It's not as much a technology problem. So, drone-based interceptors, cheap interceptors based on rockets, et cetera, exist. Light radars exist as well, and teams can be equipped with them. You can also convert various types of sort of medium altitude drones with high endurance for the air component of the mission. And I think they're actually optimized for that much more so than traditional fixed wing aviation. And you can make them pretty good effective interceptors, a lot of drones as well. What the war has shown is drones are one of the cheapest counters to other types of drones. And you can easily optimize drone systems at a much lower cost to intercept more expensive drones. Okay, here's the challenge. First, European militaries lack the force structure, right, in order to do any of this. This is manpower intensive, and you need to have the actual force structure to do it. So you need to make the allocation. Part of the reason they lack is they don't have great force capacity to begin with, right? So they will need to substantially expand forces that can actually be equipped with these capabilities. Second, we're quite far behind on training. If you look at what parts of our forces are training with drones, this is very, very like early days. This is, alphabet cube level of trying to figure out how to use drones in the force, okay? So it will take time to train up the force that you would establish to do any of these things. We could obviously do it better with technology and automation, but nonetheless, if you want to cover airspace of a sizable country like Poland, you're going to have to invest in the force. You have to train it, invest in those capabilities. The solutions are available, and they're not necessarily that expensive.
Are those things hard? I mean, so NATO is at peacetime. So to have like that, like, I mean, I feel like what you both are describing like takes a lot of, like you're saying, manpower, resources. Like it feels like a different posture. I mean, obviously Ukraine is on a full wartime footing. So would in this moment right now, are NATO, are European countries anywhere near ready to be able to do those things, given that we're on a totally different footing?
Yeah, so they are significantly increasing defense spending. The question is, where are they going to spend it on? right? This is a question for Germany and other countries. They're all talking about that they're going to expand parts of the force. Sweden, Germany, Poland. Their defense spending has increased considerably. The question is on what? There are different ways. You can consume that defense spending pretty easily if you want to, buying high-end systems and all sorts of things, and traditional capabilities that then the military will later on struggle to maintain and will have a lower readiness level, as one can come to expect. But what I'm saying is that the money is there. Actually, the conversation in Europe right now is that they've increased defense spending. Their defense industrial complex is not in a position to absorb the spending. They would traditionally buy these things from the United States begrudgingly. Okay. The United States is now increasingly looking like certain capabilities Europe would want to buy, we don't want to sell, like Patriot batteries and others, because we want to buy them for ourselves. This is a bit of an ironic situation we've ended up in. So yeah, the money is there and it's available. The challenge, I think, is that Europe really needs to invest in expanding the size of the forces and then allocating parts of the force for its drone mission, right? And that's where things begin. Without that, you're just acquiring the capability won't fix it. Lastly, air power optimization. Okay, this is the other issue. Like in the meanwhile, we have to work with what we got, right? And what we have are things like Patriot batteries, IRIS-Ts, what have you, and then we have a lot of air power. And should air power be intercepting drones with expensive variants of AIM-120s? No, that's very obvious an answer. Okay, well, if they have to do it, what should they do it with, right? There are different systems available, cheap laser guided rockets, things of that nature. Now, I also have a dream of an F-35 with rocket pods strapped to it, firing 70 millimeter laser guided rockets at a drone. I just want to see it, but that's my own.
Vietnam.
Yeah, Jim, that's just my own separate kind of fantasy. And believe it or not, I actually think that's what we're going to end up doing before long, because I don't see a lot of great things in between. But yeah, it's a question also of optimization.
I agree.
Jim, do you have any other questions on Europe? I want to slide one last question before we go to Stacy on China, but on drones.
Just the last one, because I know we're running short on time, but I keep thinking about the Danish foreign minister who had to appear on TV in Denmark to reassure the Danish people that things are under control, that they're working on this. She said something like, "You can sleep well tonight, knowing that something or another." That's a big job. Going before the Danish people and talking about things that whether it's Denmark or anywhere else, including the United States, is not talked about in polite society. These kinds of things. And she's got and the Danes are really afraid. Not afraid. They're certainly uneasy. Right now, their main airport is constantly being shut down. And with no end in sight. What do you say if you're the foreign minister? How would you say it? How would you talk about this? What would you say? Don't worry, we've got gun trucks that we're buying from Ukraine. Would you say that our F-16s and our F-35s, we got some Vietnam era gun missile pods we're going to bolt on to the? How do you express to your people that you're on top of this? How do you even talk about this? And I raise this knowing there's no answer, but it's something I think these nations are. The Poles are having to do this. We hear what Radek says. Tusk has been saying similar things too, but the European populace is now going to have to grapple with these things. Romanians, the Norwegians, the Swedes and Finns have been very upfront with their people, talking about get ready for conflict. They've been handing out booklets to everybody, Sweden and Finland, saying we're approaching this time and you begin to stockpile. So everyone's kind of taking it differently, but just put your creative hat on. And what would you say if you were the foreign minister to convey to the Danish people that you are taking actions and this is what I'm doing? ABC. Stacy, I
think this is an impossible problem, and you've seen it not just in Europe, you've seen it in the US. The New Jersey hysteria, people were up in arms over drones. They were saying that there were drones when there weren't. The situation seems a little bit different, and it clearly, it at least seems like it's linked to other activities and to an international actor, but this is a real problem that all countries are going to have to deal with. Drones, the small drones from the group 1 to the group 3 are a ubiquitous threat. They're everywhere in the world. Terrorists are going to have them, criminals are going to have them, and countries like Denmark, like most of Europe and the United States, just haven't faced threats like this before. And it is scary because it's tied to this technology and it's hard to attribute who is using it. But honestly, it's not that different than the threat of terrorism, which liberal states have had to learn to deal with, right? They have found ways to counter it at home. There's law enforcement, there's intelligence that they're using internationally to try to stop it. It becomes more of that side of the house problem than necessarily the gun trucks are going to be flying above. Driving around Copenhagen, the airport, though maybe, who knows? It depends where they find out these are coming from. And it is a threat that countries need to take seriously and need to figure out their policies and how they're going to deal with this and make sure that they do have some capabilities. But some of it is there is an irreducible amount of vulnerability that people have to just accept if they're going to be in a liberal society. So,
Okay,
But
last question. Is just on the China side of the house. And I guess in more of like a baseline setting. So obviously we are focused on the use of Russian drones and the threat in Europe. But just to put the relative kind of risks out there, where is China in all of this? I mean, relative to where the US is, well, relative to where Russia is. And yeah, just talk a little bit about that, just so we kind of have a better full spectrum
sure.
picture.
I mean, it's hard to make, they're not really apples to apples comparisons because you need to think about it in the context of the scenarios that you're going to be involved in. And as always with China, if you're thinking about Taiwan scenario or other scenarios in East Asia or Southeast Asia, the geography is so different for the United States and for China that that is sort of the determinative thing. China can use a lot of smaller, cheaper drones in a way that Russia has. So China has one of the more active drone programs in the world, and they showcased a lot of their high-end drones in the recent military parade, including supposedly stealth ones, a number of different loyal wingman type or collaborative combat aircraft, whether they actually work and have the autonomy developed for them to fly and be used in the way that the US, for example, is thinking about is unknown. But they also have taken note of what's going on in Ukraine and clearly been learning from Russia and have stated that they're investing in more than 1 million one-way attack kamikaze drones. If I were them, I would be building Shahed-like drones to round out their very impressive inventory of long-range missiles. And what we worried about and what we were considering in our report was in the context of a more protracted conflict, that type of weapon would give China an ability to suppress US operations inside of the first island chain, whether it's ground forces or air forces, because they could just launch these persistent and frequent attacks that are able to actually damage aircraft or hit personnel and kill them, but not as spectacularly as a ballistic missile or a hypersonic missile. And that's something that the U.S. military just really hasn't begun to think about yet. I think there's been a hope that if you were to get in a war, the inventory of Chinese high-end missiles would dwindle quickly and that would open things up. And the realization is that drones are this great supplement and complement, as we've seen Russia use them against Ukraine to pretty horrific effect lately.
Wow. There's a lot there. And I was just also looking at this. I mean, and on of course, we have, hard to do an episode without axis of upheaval, but also looking at the Reuters reporting about the Chinese drone experts working with a sanctioned Russian entity too. So thinking about the sharing of technology, building of best practices, et cetera. And Russia's operational experience fighting with drones flowing to the Chinese as well. So, I think we need another episode, Jim, dedicated just to kind of
Yeah.
these issues.
But Mike, did you have something that you wanted to say? We were bumping around, and I thought I saw your hand raised. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, it's Friday morning, and there are a couple points I missed. I want to add. Stacy's comments are great. I'm not going to add anything to China, because I'm not a China-focused military analyst. But I think two things I wanted to add to the conversation. One was on the air defense side, we don't talk enough about situational awareness and having made the right changes in terms of sensors and having a common operating pictures that actually presents much better situational awareness of the drone threat, which is a lot harder than traditional manned aviation. It's much easier to detect 3 MiG-31s coming through your airspace than things like this. And Ukrainians did this by fusing acoustic sensors with traditional radar. And the data solutions are out there; they're available. Okay, this is part one of it. And having that available to the whole force, where everybody who's a gunner or any other type of air defense operator has on a tablet and can see the same picture that everybody else. Okay, this is a technical side. The last one, and I want to just bring this as the last comment on kind of NATO response to it. So one thing that I just wanted to give my own view on military incidents is that while there isn't a need to be overly reckless and risk-taking, okay, I do not hold to believe that wars have accidental causes, and I do not believe in this reading of history. The causes of war are political. The history of the Cold War and many other prolonged periods of confrontation show that if two states do not want to go to war with each other, if there's a military incident between them, an aircraft gets shot down, someone gets killed, okay, two ships run into each other like we used to do with the Russians, all sorts of shouldering incidents and what have you, is not going to lead to a war. It's not even necessarily going to lead to a crisis, okay? However, if states do want to go to war, at least one wants to go to war, then yes, they are looking for the crisis as a casus belli and try to leverage that. And so you always have to make a judgment. Does Russia want the war with NATO? My natural disposition is say, of course not, and they would lose, all right? And I think rather decisively. And certainly I don't think NATO wants a war with Russia. So that then allows you to say, okay, if there is a military incident, if an aircraft shot down, is it going to lead to some kind of uncontrolled escalation? Well, not very, very unlikely, and it's not likely that that will be the cause of the war. The cause of the war will be something else. Okay, and so that's the way I kind of look at, and that's okay. I wanted to just a two finger from Jim to provoke.
I know we're both have two fingers.
No, but this is no, Andrew. But this is important. This is important because how you respond to these sort of things goes back to your belief system on causes of war and how international relations works, which all of us have, and we have implicit assumptions that we don't often state explicitly. And when you are in a conversation on these topics, you need to at some point bring out the explicit assumptions on how you think wars are actually caused and whether incident will cause a war and cause uncontrolled escalation or not. All right.
I totally agree with you. So I think the risk of a NATO-Russia war is low, but what I worry is about consequences short of that. And it was all the things that we talked about before, which is basically starting to fracture NATO into the coalition of the willing, peeling the United States off. I mean, right now we're having all of this talk. Everybody's calling everybody a paper tiger, right? So Trump has said, Russia's a paper tiger. They say, no, we're a bear. But I think also the Russians want to show NATO as a paper tiger, that we're going to do stuff. And you all are too scared to respond. And so NATO really as a concept is discredited. It's really nothing more than the paper that it's written on. So the risk of war might be low, but I think there's still lots of problematic consequences that could come out of this escalation and a potential incident. And Jim cannot control himself.
I know. I'm just dying here. I agree. First, Mike, I agree with you. Absolutely agree with you on what you were saying. But I'm going to add something to it. And Andrea, I agree with what you said too. I think what you were saying. And the thing is, while NATO might not want to have a war with Russia, where Russia might not want to have a war with NATO, does Poland want to have a war with Russia? And does Russia want to have a war with Poland? NATO aside, remember they're going to get rid of this law that says that the Poles have some crazy law that says NATO has to agree if they're going to pull a trigger. I don't know how they got that kind of law, but they're going to make sure their weapons hot. So my question is, given the hot temper that we've got in Warsaw and in Moscow, and the rhetoric there. And these two guys with this, not just ancient, but it's modern historical hatred for one another, that they're not, Poland is not going to be held back by NATO, it's, I can just see it's like West Side Story, they're the Jets and the whatever, they're not going to hold this guy back. The Poles are they're anxious to land a punch, and Russia might be too. So in terms of the panoply of how wars start and all that kind of thing, in this case, I think you've got to throw in the spice of these two guys hating each other, and NATO, or be damned, they want to land a punch on the Russians, and the Russians want to land a punch on them. And that might be, and it goes to what Andrea was saying, how this thing fractures into coalitions of the willing and this type of thing, as well as something as regional as these two countries that want to have it at each other, the consequences be damned. So I'm going to just put that on the table as just something interesting to think about. Last point, and then no more, Andrea, I promise. My question on the foreign minister also included this. It wasn't just talking about the drones, but the idea that Denmark is finding itself getting closer and closer into potentially into a conflict. That the prime minister, has had to talk about that too. Swedes and Finns are. And so the Danes can talk about the drones, and in a very realistic and very pragmatic way, the way we would do with terrorism, exactly what you're saying, Stacey. But I think also for her, she has to look at a bigger picture too, which is Denmark, are no longer in a place where we were 5 years ago of Nordic peace and quiet and all those great things. That their region and their country is slipping closer to conflict with the Russians. And this is something that they have got to begin to think about. I think she had, and I didn't read what she said, but that's the kind of thing that for her, they're on the front line of this. They got it worse than anybody else so far, and she's having to make the point. This isn't something that's limited and just a couple of drones by some prankster. That this is actually getting us closer into conflict, probably with Russia. We've got a Russian ship right off the coast of Denmark that they have now they had lost it, and they found it about 24 hours ago. That they think this is where so they're getting close. And so as the foreign minister, she's having to pull the Danish people into her world, which is scarier for Danes than it was 5 years ago. No more from me.
All right, drop the mic. You're out. So
I'm
are
done.
we. This was an amazing discussion. Really, really, really good. I think it's obviously underscored we need more on this topic. So hopefully we'll do this again. But for now, Stacey and Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
And thanks for letting me vent. I know
That's what this podcast is.
This is Jim's therapy session.
This was fun. Thanks.
Thanks everyone. Great.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.